They can affect the environment with just their presence. A moving natural disaster.
Too powerful to tame. Too difficult to reproduce. Sounds like an elder dragon.
These are the lines that introduce us to the inclusion of elders in Monster Hunter World's Ascendance, a massive expansion which is both a continuation of the story set up in the base game, and one that is going to be, quote, deeply connected to elder dragons. While I could make a straightforward elder dragon prediction video, a lot of my picks are the same as the ones I brought up in my trailer analysis video. I'm going to include them later on anyway, but I am, at heart, a humanities scholar and a lover of narrative themes and symbolism. And while these lines might not tell us which elder dragons are going to make the cut for Ascendance, they actually tell us a lot about how the expansion is aiming to use them. The lines do this in two ways. The first is in what we can infer or discern about how these lines might actually be used in the game itself. The second is the vibe that these lines convey in being chosen by the devs to represent the focus on elder dragons in Ascendance. That is, they symbolize how Ascendance wants to use elder dragons and what expectations we might build around that assumption. I'm going to tackle these in order. Firstly, while these lines are juxtaposed in the trailer to introduce the return of Kushala Daora, they are said by two different characters, likely in two different scenarios. I am unsure if we know who is saying these lines, for example, if the voices match one for our player hunters or an NPC, but regardless, they likely do not go together, at least in this order. If they do actually occupy the same scene, they are likely reversed, with the first acting as a follow-up to a question that comes after the latter. That is, sounds like an elder dragon. What's an elder dragon? They can infect in the environment with just their presence, a moving natural disaster. It might seem weird for us players for characters to not know what an elder dragon is, but it's important to remember that the existence of elder dragons is not actually common knowledge within the world, and many of the details around them are classified by the Hunters Guild. It would not be unusual for a resident of the Eastlands in Kunafa, Azuz, or Sild, or even a junior hunter like Nata, to not actually know what an elder dragon is. While we did evacuate the people of Azuz due to Gogmazios, it's never clarified if we told them why they were being evacuated beyond the imminent threat of some powerful monster, not what that monster is, either specifically or in terms of genus or species. That said, there's more we can read here. The second line is clearly a response to a new piece of information, and the way it is phrased makes it sound like a response to a research report about a monster. And not specifically a sighting of one, but likely some either local or Wyverian records found in Sild or one of the villages or in the Skybound area itself. The character speaking is learning here that a specific monster was, quote, too powerful to tame and too difficult to reproduce. The latter almost certainly a reference to the Guardian process, and concludes that this is likely describing an elder dragon. I believe this line is either going to refer to the new flagship monster, or to a mysterious entity central to the story, our equivalent of Iceborne's old Everworm, for example. Critically, I think this also has to be the description for a new monster, or at least a monster that is unknown to us when the description is encountered. The first line is more ambiguous. If it is not a response to a follow-up question about the mystery monster, it could be a response to a question about either elder dragons in general, or to a specific elder dragon. That is, they could be operating either as a plural or as a gender-neutral singular. Most elders are not sexually dimorphic, after all, outside of Teostra and Lunastra. If it's the latter, the line could describe either Kushala or Lao Shan Lung, both of whom fit the description of moving natural disaster. My guess personally is that if this line is referring to a specific elder rather than elders broadly, it's referring to Lao, an elder defined by its inexorable forward momentum, leaving nothing but wreckage in its wake. irrespective of their actual in-game contexts, that these lines were chosen to foreground Elder inclusion in the expansion in the reveal trailer tells us a lot about how Elders are going to be treated. The first line foregrounds the environment and Elder Dragons' function as natural calamities. In a game that already structures a lot of its narrative around the ecosystems of the Eastlands and the role of the Dragon Torch and the inclemencies it generates have in creating and maintaining that ecosystem, this line tells us that the Elder Dragon inclusion in the story is going to intersect with this existing context. Whether this means Elders will introduce their own bespoke inclemencies or merely interact with, exacerbate, or dampen the existing ones is currently unknown, but the line tells us that this relationship is going to be foregrounded to some capacity. The second line tells us that we are still dealing with Wyverian experimentation. The devs stating that Ascendance is a continuation of the story set up in the base game, and the inclusion of Guardian monsters in the Skybound Eyrie, to say nothing of the Eyrie itself and the technology that sustains it, establishes this general framing. However, this line tells us that we are likely going to be delving into the origin process of both the Guardians generally, and likely Xochitl as the only known quote-unquote Elder Dragon Guardian, and one that spelled the downfall of Wyverian civilization after it couldn't be, well, tamed. The second part of the line is even more important, in that it tells us that this Elder Dragon, and we have to remember this line is definitely about a specific monster, was itself too difficult to reproduce in Guardian form. And through the context of this line, that Elder Dragons in general are probably too difficult to reproduce using the tech that Wyveria had available to it. This is why I think the line is chiefly going to refer to some aspect of the process that ultimately led to the creation of Xochitl. Zo is the only quasi-successful Elder Guardian that we are aware of, but it is also wrong. It flits between an angelic bird-like whelk shell, and it's worth noting here that its initial damaged head is very much like a bird skull, and an entity overcome by explosive tumor-like growths, originating, we can infer, from the inclusion of Fatalis elements in its construction. Critically here, though, Xochitl's moveset and appearance emulates not only the three variants of Fatalis, although they are quite prominent, but also several other Elders. Here's a video by another YouTuber that kind of goes over the animation similarities between Zo and other Elders in the franchise. Xochitl is a strange chimerical Elder, and the way that the more Fatalis aspects of it manifest, that is, as kind of explosive tumors, suggests to me that this Guardian was not actually originally intended as a Guardian Fatalis, but rather that Fatalis components were just used in its creation and did what Fatalis components are said to do. My pet theory as of now, and I've talked about this in other videos, is that the initial base model for Xochitl was not actually an Elder Dragon fully, but rather a Demi-Elder like Gore. Demi-Elder as a category was formally introduced in Wilds, saving Gore from its imprisonment in the Y-Academy Scratching Head taxon. The most notable mechanical difference between the two is that Demi-Elders can actually be captured, and I think it would be really interesting if Ascendance lent into the lore implications of what is primarily a gameplay-related quirk, with Wyveria capturing a Demi-Elder and using it as the base template to then create a chimerical hybrid Elder Dragon Guardian. Bonus points that if it's bird-like, we can reinforce the bird in a cage imagery that resonates with that of Chained Arcvelt from the base game. It's a bit basic in terms of symbolism, but it could also go really hard, and while Monster Hunter Wilds is really good with its themes, I won't say its themes are super original, rather they're just incredibly well executed. Regardless of what the new flagship or the origins of Xochitl turn out to be, however, the initial framing for Elder inclusion gives me a lot to hope for in Ascendance. As a final note, I want to stress that a story that is deeply connected to Elder Dragons does not actually necessarily mean that we will be getting a lot of them. I think we'll definitely get a bunch, but I would be shocked if out of a total roster that is likely going to drop in the 33 to 34 monster range, even after title updates, we get more than, say, 8 to 10 Elder Dragons. That is, around what World and Iceborne gave us individually. We're still going to get a bunch of non-Elder monsters, both in terms of returners and new monsters, variants, and subspecies. The complete absence of Elder Dragons for the most part from base Wilds means that any variants or subspecies we get from the base Wilds roster is going to have to be non-Elder related. That said, deeply connected still means a lot, as does the way their inclusion is being set up. My own sense here is that we are going to discover that the inclemencies that form the basis of the Eastland's ecology will ultimately turn out to have been attempts to recreate or reverse engineer the weather manipulating impacts of Elder Dragons. And if Elder Dragon powers are the initial template for creating the inclemencies, then their presence in the Eastlands may be both a problem and a potential solution to the issues of the Dragon Torch itself left unresolved from the base game. I do believe this means we are getting Elders that mirror the inclemencies in some way. Kushala Daora's presence in the Windward Plains in the trailer seems like evidence in this direction, and while Kushala is distinctly not a lightning dragon, it's actually weak to the element, there's no reason to think its windstorm capabilities could not have been hybridized with abilities from another elder like, say, Kirin, in order to create the Sand Tide. If we associate Kushala at least partly with the plains, however, then the other biomes need to have some form of a template elder. Teostra and Lunastra are the most obvious candidates for the basin. Elders that actually produce fire-like environmental effects are shockingly rare in the franchise outside of large set-piece vices like Gogmazios or Diamoralis. The only way I can see the basin not getting either Teostra or Lunastra or both is if a new Fire Elder is introduced in the expansion, akin to how Namiel was introduced in Iceborne. Speaking of Namiel, Namiel's control of water, or indeed Chameleos' mist abilities to stick with the DOS trio, could work similarly well as a template for the downpour in the forest, although Namiel's preference for high altitudes might keep her in the Eyrie. The Frost Winds, meanwhile, could derive from either Velkhana or Orochi Kirin. I lean towards the latter because it is smaller and likely more manageable, and fits into the Cliffs biome. And also, if base Kirin may have had a horn or hoof in the Lightning of the Plains, then its variant works well on the Cliffs. I do not think this means that standard Kirin is also necessarily in, although it would definitely give a returning Rajang something to hunt down. On the other hand, a Rajang subspecies or variant who has metabolized an Orochi Kirin horn might be a really interesting direction for the monster. Maybe it would become super zen. You've heard of Furious Rajang, now prepare for Chillaxed Rajang, Drunken Master. It's also worth noting that while I believe these elders will be associated with the core biomes and likely have provided the template for the inclemencies in the first place, they may not actually be contained to these respective biomes within the expansion itself. If the devs want to lean harder into the weather and the sense of natural calamity, having the elders potentially roam across all 4 core biomes, creating weather effects that either intensify or dampen the relevant inclemencies, could be an excellent feature. Kushala could create windstorms in the forest or the basin. Chameleos' mist or Namiel's control of water could be used to blanket the basin in thick fog and weaken the effects of the fire spring, or alternatively to make the frost winds even more dangerous. While Teostra, for example, could add Flaming Dander to intensify the Sand Tide or weaken the Frost Winds. I do think it's important to have some low and mid-tier elders like these to flesh out the map dynamics and interact with the base game's apex monsters. I think it would be a great touch if, while other large monsters and small monsters flee the maps before the elders' presence, the regional apexes specifically remained and attempted to spar with the intruders. I just think this would be a really neat element of the way that the base game and Ascendance could interact on an individual map level. And Shigaru Magala is definitely going in the Eyrie. The core of the biome looks a bit too much like Heaven's Mount for it not to be there, and Gore is already in the game, so shrug. That said, If we get a couple of elders in the new monster category, either the flagship and the final boss, or the final boss and some newcomer, perhaps the new fire elder, then the 6 I've outlined here already makes us hit 8. 9 with Lao, who I suspect will be our primary siege fight in at least the base expansion. That doesn't actually leave much room for the inclusion of a Nergigante or a Dalamador, or, given the new director worked on Generations Ultimate as lead game designer, a Valstrax. So we'll have to play it by ear going forward. Regardless, I'm really excited to get new information over the coming months and see what nuggets of insight I can tease out of incidental dialogue that I am doubtless putting far too much weight on. Thank you all for being here. Please like and subscribe and comment if your heart drives you. The next couple of videos might not be Monster Hunter related, although that depends a bit on news and my personal whims, but I will definitely be circling back to it over the coming months, and then of course once Ascendance is out. I have a couple of videos talking about the themes of Monster Hunter Wilds that I really want to get done, and those are going to be going up sometime probably in the next few weeks. This has been Laraika Laray, signing off.
More than I can give. I tried to touch its cosmic sheen, but today all I smell is chlorine. Yesterday I was deep sea diving, but today I found a floor. Run my fingers over its surface, but I couldn't find a door.